Hi there, I'm Joey from EDHREC, and in this video I'd like to investigate a simple but interesting question. Why doesn't Sol Ring, one of the most quintessential commander cards, show up in 100% of commander decks? According to the data on EDHREC, Sol Ring, one of if not the most famous cards in the entire format, currently shows up in 84% of the over 2 million commander decks in the EDHREC database. Doing some quick math, that means 359,797 people are not playing Sol Ring in their commander decks. And this is actually a stat that we sometimes get contacted about. Every so often we get emails or DMs from people asking, what's up with the 16% absence here? A short time ago, the official EDHREC account posted a similar question, asking folks why they don't play Sol Ring, and there were many responses to this. This video will cover some of the actual data behind the scenes, so we'll get to that in a moment, but the anecdotal responses are an interesting place to start off. One of the primary reasons that people gave was, for instance, companions. A Karuga companion cannot play low-cost cards, Gyruda can't play odd-mana cards, and Umori companions have type restrictions for the entire deck, so an all-creature or an all-enchantments deck can't use artifacts. Another reason people gave a lot were concerning pip requirements, especially in mono-colored and 5-colored decks. Some folks reported that Sol Ring's colorless mana production doesn't help cast their color-intensive commanders, for instance, such as Ayara, First of Locthwain, or the activated ability of Joda, Archmage Eternal. A few strategy-specific choices popped up too. Some players reported that in an Enchantress deck or a Landfall deck, they would prefer not to have a mana rock taking up a slot when a land or an enchantment card could have branching synergies that work with the rest of the 99. And finally, there were plenty of folks who also said that they just don't play it because they just don't want to. It's fast mana, and an early ring or an early mana crypt or any form of that type of fast mana creates a table dynamic that they just don't particularly like. There were other types of responses too, but those were the primary categories of responses that we tended to see. And if you want to check out the responses on that post for yourself, it's linked in the description below. Now, in addition to all of those responses, there was another undercurrent that I noticed here and there as well, and I actually got directly messaged about it a couple of times from folks too. And that undercurrent was, in a word, skepticism. There were more than a handful of folks who saw some of those responses and they were like, yeah, those are not good enough reasons to cut Sol Ring. Some of the messages I got even encouraged me to use Sol Ring as a potential upcoming Challenge the Stats in a future podcast episode, because according to those folks, the 84% inclusion rate is evidence that the card, despite its fame, is actually being underplayed. That, according to those folks, the people who were not playing Sol Ring were doing it wrong, that it was an oversight or a misguided choice. To paraphrase some of the messages I got here, the card is so powerful that even if you think you've got a good reason to not play Sol Ring, you should still probably play Sol Ring. And honestly, I really wouldn't be shocked at all if there are people leaving that exact sentiment in the comments of this video right this very second. But so far, this has just been anecdotal stuff. So let's actually get to some data to really get to the bottom of this. We ran a report on EDHREC to see which commanders play Sol Ring the least often, and we found some pretty cool results. The first and most obvious was Nikia of the Old Ways, whose ability prevents you from even casting Sol Ring in the first place. Only 19% of Nikia decks play the ring at all. Sasaya Orochi Ascendant and Seton Krosan Protector only use Sol Ring 28 and 33% of the time respectively. Sasaya clearly needs as many forests in hand to make her effect work at all, so she plays on average like 43 lands, and mana rocks just get in the way of that. Meanwhile, Seton's mana cost and mana production is such that Sol Ring doesn't appear to be super necessary for the strategy. It keeps going. Demon Lord Belzenlok has a very good reason to avoid tiny cost cards, since they would shut off his ability to dump a bajillion cards into your hand, and that's why only a third of his decks contain Sol Ring. Heck, the average Belzenlok deck plays more than 50 lands, so that just one Belzenlok trigger can put the entire deck into your hand and find a sick combo. Child of Alara also has a pretty good reason to avoid any mana rocks. Less than 40% of these decks use it because if Child of Alara blows everything up, that ring goes bye-bye anyway. In fact, this is likely also why Serulf Realm Eater decks play Sol Ring less than 50% of the time too. The doggo would chew up the ring, and we can't have that. In both cases, you'd much rather use ramp that your commander won't blow up. Another 5-color commander plays Ring less than 50% of the time too, and that's Jared Carthalion, a precon commander whose pre-constructed deck famously did not include a Soul Ring. The whole strategy cares about multicolor cards, so arguably colorless mana production wouldn't actually help cast a lot of the spells in the deck. And for one final noteworthy commander that plays Soul Ring in fewer than 50% of the decks, Cody Vociferous Codex brings us right back to the same logic as Nikia, where the commander actively prevents you from being able to play the card at all, and it would just get stranded in your hand. So those are the commanders that play Soul Ring less than half of the time. And to kind of reveal my hand here a little bit, when I first started looking over this report, I kind of expected the list of good examples to run dry pretty quickly. That there might be like one-offs, but that would kind of be it. Like, sure, Nikia is a good example of a reason not to play Soul Ring, but I didn't expect there to be a whole lot more beyond that. And to go even further, I also went into this kind of more or less agreeing with several of the messages that I had received. I wasn't positive that all the reasons people had given for avoiding a Soul Ring were necessarily strong or compelling reasons to avoid a Soul Ring. Like, if you're not playing it because you don't like fast mana, then yeah, that makes sense to me. That's a strong reason. But if you're not playing it because your commander Ayara has 3 black pips in her mana cost and Soul Ring can't help cast that I'm less convinced by, because there are other cards in your deck that Soul Ring can help cast. And you can also use it on command decks, that sort of thing. But if we keep digging and push just a little bit above that 50% threshold, well, it kind of shows us a whole lot more. And I think it's really, really edifying. Once again, we start to see some common themes and categories clumped together. And it's pretty interesting to see whether or not those align with the anecdotal responses that were shared. For example, a bunch of enchantment-heavy commanders showed up with the lowest Soul Ring numbers. The biggest example is Farika, who plays Soul Ring just 54% of the time. Farika in particular is well known for pairing up with an Umori companion. But even if we view that just as an exception, plenty of other enchantment-heavy commanders cropped up too. Kestia, 55%, Mazi, 59%, Sithis, 60%, Tuvasa, Siona, Estrid, all in the low 60 range as well. In these decks, casting one enchantment spell can draw you so many cards, or create tons of tokens and power up your constellation effects. I see a compelling reason why even a less effective enchantment ramp spell could actually have better returns for you than a dang good mana rock. Meanwhile, Landfall showed an even deeper pool. Mina and Den only play Soul Ring 53% of the time, and Phylath and Maya only play it 56 and 57%. To get a bit mono-green, both new Titanias as well as the Flip Planeswalker Nissa Vastwood Seer are also all below 60%. Following shortly after that, we have Greensleeves, Hazazon, and Borborygmos Enraged, all in the low 60 range. And in some of these cases, it's sort of an echo of that Sasaya example that we saw earlier. Borborygmos' average deck, for instance, contains like 44 lands, so we really do see the value that a land card has in these lists. And some folks might look at these and say, well, yeah, but these are more obscure landfall decks, right? Well, Omnath of the Royal and Omnath of Creation only play Soul Ring 64 and 65% of the time, and Slogurk is also just under the 2/3 mark. Heck, if we're willing to venture just above the 2/3 barrier, we also see Soul of Windgrace playing at 67%, Azusa at 68%, and Tatiova at a nice 69%. There is probably something to be said for the increase in a landfall commander's popularity also correlating a bit with an increased likelihood of playing Soul Ring, but at the same time, these are some big names that are still only playing Soul Ring about 2/3 of the time. In fact, when I looked at landfall decks overall, the highest play for Soul Ring that I could find was AC with an 87% play rate. Though even that feels kind of nuanced because not all players run AC just as a landfall deck. Plenty of folks play it as a Sea Monsters deck, where they're not manipulating land cards quite so explicitly. But for dedicated lands decks, yeah, when a single land means, for instance, drawing another card or making more Scoot Swarms, I understand why the ring might feel like it sometimes gets in the way of a value train that doesn't need extra mana assistance. And it doesn't stop there, not at all. Another big category of decks that don't play the ring are the ones who care very hard about creatures, a lot like Nikia from earlier. For example, only 52% of Hogak players run the ring. Ring is great, but this deck needs a lot of mana dorks and mill if it wants to play and replay that commander to aggro beat down your enemies. Soul Ring, paradoxically, would slow Hogak down. Similarly, Izoni decks only play Soul Ring about 54% of the time. There's a good case to argue here that Izoni prefers prefers every mana dork under the sun, and her average deck plays over 40 creatures in it to truly capitalize on her Undergrowth ability. Gerard ends up feeling the same way about creatures in the yard, and only 65% of his decks play it. These decks are both built to manipulate the death of your creatures, so if you could have creatures providing mana instead of artifacts providing mana, you get a good payoff. And Rurik's Thar, much like Nikia, punishes you if you play the ring. Now, granted, like with Cody, like with Nikia, you can just play the Soul Ring when those commanders aren't on the field, but clearly there are plenty of folks out there who feel that the restriction just isn't worth the trouble. Even Sidisi comes up on the 2/3 line, as her deck has to be very careful about its total creature count to make sure that she can reliably make enough zombies. And related to this whole matter of creature count are also a bunch of decks who honestly just make a whole bunch of mana on their own already. Raga Draga decks only use Soul Ring 57% of the time, and same with Abomination of Llanowar. OG Azuri is at 61%. All the elves and mana dorks that these decks play provide a ton of mana already, and a mana dork in play or in the graveyard could be the difference between these decks achieving lethal damage or not. Why play a ring when you already have tons upon tons upon tons of mana-making creatures that can also be turned into weapons against your enemies? And there are more examples beyond this. Catilda turns creatures into mana makers, so it's sitting pretty without Soul Ring as well, and Eudora and Ashaya turn creatures into lands, so they're also flush with resources. Now, notably, more than half of players still deem Soul Ring to be worth it in these decks, but a substantial number of players have decided to lean away from it, to go for more synergistic options when possible. And I understand why they'd feel that way. A personal favorite trend that I noticed was also Cascade or Polymorph decks. Specifically, Emoti and Illuna came in with 61 and 62% Soul Ring usage. These types of strategies skim through the whole deck to find very specific cards. Sometimes the whole deck is built to only hit one target off of the Polymorph or the Cascade effect, so a Soul Ring would obstruct that game plan. Nifty stuff. And finally, the last group commonality to notice here are the ones that sort of fall into pip and mana requirements. 5-color decks are prominent again here. Niv Mizzet Reborn, for instance, only uses Soul Ring 52% of the time, presumably because it's not a multicolored card that Niv would draw, and also because so many of the cards in the deck are multicolored with strong pip requirements that a colorless source wouldn't help fulfill. I presume this is also why only 61% of Horde of Notions decks and 62% of Progenitus decks use the ring too. But it's not just 5-color decks here. Rigo Streetwise Mentor, for example, uses ring only 60% of the time because nearly everything in the deck is a 1-mana card that requires a colored mana to cast. Speaking of colored mana, we see the same percentage for Omnath Locus of Mana, who wants green mana to get stuff done. And hey, Adeliz the Cinderwind, also only 62%. Not only is the deck full of low-drop creatures, but it's also using bunches of 1-mana cantrip-style spells, so colored mana is at a huge premium. I kind of expected the famous Feather to show up here, but she's actually in the 75% Soul Ring usage range. When I had that deck together, I still used Soul Ring myself, but I do remember the colorless mana frustrating me a couple of times because all those 1-mana cards really added up in the pip-heavy decks. Also, real quick, I reached out to some CEDH luminaries in the community as well, including Rules Committee member Jim Lepage and my buddy Lenny Woolley, to see if they happened to know of any competitive decks that specifically choose not to use the ring. Jim mentioned Animar Soul of Elements as an example, since the commander already reduces your colorless mana requirements and its combos wouldn't be assisted by a ring. Lenny also mentioned Animar, as well as some competitive Sithis decks and Eureka decks. But overall, all the CEDH folks I talked to felt that there were very, very few instances where Soul Ring didn't warrant use in the competitive end of the format. As Lenny described, even in Stax decks that use Stony Silence or a Collector Oof to shut down treasures and mana rocks, Soul Ring's use as a ritual to get those effects out faster is still really darn useful. Thanks so much for your help, friends, and y'all go watch or read Jim and Lenny's content. They're awesome. And that point of a thing still being really darn useful, that is what sticks to me. I mean, we went through a whole bunch of examples just now, but let's not forget that most of the examples cited in this video still show Soul Ring is being played more than half of the time. The majority of players who are using these commanders are still playing a Soul Ring, even if there are some justifications not to. And in a lot of these cases, I still usually end up falling on the side of, yeah, but it's a Soul Ring. Like even in the Feather example that I mentioned, that deck had a very heavy pip requirement in the spells that it was casting, but I'm still over here like, but as a Sol Ring, I want to use it. But at the same time, I have dabbled in Enchantress, and let me tell ya, I have drawn a Sol Ring in the middle of a chain of Enchantress triggers, and that Sol Ring, not being an enchantment, brought the whole value train to a standstill. And that doesn't feel great. Or I have an OG Titania deck, and every so often, I find myself facing off with that Sol Ring in that deck and just being like, if only you were a land, I would have had more tokens. And if I would have had more tokens, I would have won that game. And also, let's not forget that there are people who play 1v1 Commander, and Sol Ring is banned in 1v1 Commander, so there's no doubt that that affects the data on EDH Rec too. People are going to be in the comments being like, why didn't you mention 1v1 Commander? Well, I did, you just didn't watch the whole video. But clearly, it cannot be said that the entire 16% gap for Sol Ring is just because of one-on-one Commander. And that's what I'm interested in, right? I'm interested in seeing why don't people play Sol Ring in the cases where they could? What are the strategical reasons for not playing an extremely powerful card? Knowing answers to questions like that, or at least trying to find an answer to a question like that, is the thing that will make us better deck builders. And here's a fun fact that'll bake your noodle. There's no commander in the database that has over 100 decks to its name where there's a 100% Sol Ring inclusion rate. There just isn't. Like, there's a 100% inclusion rate for those commanders that are like 1 decks, 2 decks, 5 decks, 7 decks, like that kind of thing. Because, yeah, a sample size of 7 decks, not necessarily a whole lot. But there aren't any commanders with more than 100 decks to their name where 100% of those players are playing Sol Ring. There's always at least 1 deck, and usually more than just 1 deck, where Sol Ring is not in the list at all. And for some commanders, those small percentage points really represent a big chunk of decks. Like, there are 20,000 Atraxa decks in the database, and 85% of them play Sol Ring. So that's 15% that don't play Sol Ring, and that means 3,000 Atraxa players are choosing not to use Sol Ring in those decks. Or there are 95% of Prosper players who play it. So that means 5% of the 12,000 Prosper decks are not using Sol Ring. So that's at least 500 people who are choosing not to play Sol Rings in those decks. That's a lot of people. And that's just the data we can see. There are many more players out there than just the data on EDH Rec represents. And after looking over all of this, with the one-on-one commanders and the companions, type restrictions, pip requirements, strategical options, things like that, I'm really not finding myself willing to say definitively that the most popular mana rock in the game is underplayed. But at the same time, I really understand why people reached out to me with skepticism about the responses they saw to the Sol Ring question. I mean, I had some of that same skepticism myself, and to an extent, I still do. There are still some of those arguments that I don't necessarily find 100% compelling. And I'm trying not to just say this flippantly and be like a jerk when I say this, or like, I'm trying to word this delicately, but I'm also just trying to speak a true thing here. I think that a lot of that reaction also sometimes comes from those moments where we see someone broadcasting an idea and content online, whatever, in a game store, yada yada. And it's one of those things where a Magic player has tried really hard to be clever and galaxy-brained, but they might just be a little bit high on their own supply. Is that a mean thing to say? I mean, that was the first thing that we said in our Commander Hot Take episode a while back, right? If you didn't see it, let me fill you in right here. Our first Commander Hot Take in our episode about Commander Hot Takes was that most Commander Hot Takes are really bad. And I think that's one of the primary reasons that people reached out to me about this. Like, I'm pretty sure that we've all been in those scenarios where we see someone who thinks that they're saying something so controversial and yet so brave, when really they might just be saying something so controversial. For instance, I have seen some folks make the claim that Sol Ring doesn't need to be in any green decks at all, because green already has enough ramp. And as politely as I can possibly say it, that is the type of hot take that makes me feel like I hope people don't take your advice. That kind of thing can be pretty fatiguing, and it makes it harder to achieve discussion about the game in a productive way. If you encounter a lot of that type of thing, it just can make it very difficult in the pressure of social situations and the pressure cooker of social media to differentiate between that type of bravado and someone genuinely expressing a real lived experience of an off-kilter or unusual but important strategical decision. All of that stuff can make it very difficult to establish a proper dialogue. And that's why I wanted to get some data in here, because I think the anecdotal responses that we received were, for the most part, very genuine. And even if I don't agree with all of them necessarily, it turns out the numbers definitely show some support to those answers, and those people are not alone by any means. The data clearly showed us some well-trod patterns. These examples were not just niche. In some cases, a third of players, or in some cases, almost up to a half, or even occasionally more than half of players, were explicitly choosing not to use one of the most powerful pieces in the entire game's history. And even if I wouldn't always make the same choice as all of those players, I become a better deck builder if I understand where they're coming from and why they make that choice. And secretly, I made this video in a last-ditch vain attempt to really try and put a nail in the coffin of the term auto-include. Because clearly, there's no such thing as an auto-include. Even Sol Ring cannot be said to be an auto-include. Even Command Tower, even basic lands cannot be said to be an auto-include. Let's retire that term. I will die on this hill. In fact, I'll link another podcast episode down in the description below where we discuss a whole bunch of other Commander staples, Cyclonic Rift, the whole works, and which decks specifically choose not to play those as well. I think it's really interesting. Check it out. Oversimplifications like the term auto-include or just saying that would only be 1v1 Commander responsible for the Sol Ring gap, all of those simple answers would prevent us from becoming better players and better deck builders. Finding room for nuance helps us understand our other players better. Finding room for nuance helps us better adapt to strategies that we've not yet played ourselves. And that's the type of thing that's going to make us better at the game. EDHREC received a bunch of responses to that question about Sol Ring, but I want to keep going. Are there other reasons that you choose not to play Sol Ring? And if so, what did you replace Sol Ring with? Are there other big staples that you choose not to play? And what do you replace those with? Let us know in the comments below, and thanks so much for watching.